In order to reindustrialize America, onshore some of these critical industries, or at least bolster what industry still exists, that's going to take time to build up. The US doesn't have that kind of time for defense items.
I'm Noah Scheinbaum, and this is Crossing the Valley. America's defense industrial base refers to the key suppliers of mission-critical platforms and subsystems that keep us safe. This can mean military systems, it can mean infrastructure or domestic production capability. A new report from Becca and Phil Shears at the Center for New American Security, or CNAS, argues that both government and industry need to make some significant changes to prepare our industrial base for a new era of global competition. I sat down with Becca and Phil to discuss their report, From Production Lines to Front Lines, Revitalizing the U.S. Defense Industrial Base for Future Great Power Conflict. Enjoy. Becca Wasser, Phil Shears, Center for New American Security, out with a new report, From Production Lines to Front Lines, Revitalizing the U.S. Defense Industrial Base for the Future of Great Power Conflict. Becca and Phil, first of all, thank you for doing the work on this. And then also, thanks for spending some time with us to go through it today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. It'll be a fun conversation.
Thanks for having us. Really happy to be here.
Let's start at the top with a foundational question, which is, what in the world is the Defense Industrial Base, or the DIB? We use that term a lot. What do you all mean by it in the context of this report?
So within the context of this report, let me break it down into some pretty key buckets. One is the major suppliers of some of the most mission-critical weapon systems that the U.S. and foreign militaries use around the world. And those we often refer to as the primes, or the major companies who can actually bid on a lot of U.S. government projects. And they happen to be the principal players in the traditional defense industrial base. But we also have a bunch of what we often refer to as non-traditionals or new entrants, who tend to be startups who are either solely focused on the defense market or happen to be these dual-use companies where they have products that they sell on the commercial side as well as products that they sell on the defense side. And then undergirding all of this is what we often refer to as the sub-tier of suppliers. And these are small businesses, mom and pop shops, mid-tier sized corporations that produce either a component or subcomponent that goes into a bigger weapon system. Or sometimes it's even something as basic as like one screw or one widget. And so that, in a short nutshell, really just sums up what we talk about when we talk about the defense industrial base. And I'll just note that these are very distinct companies. These are distinct companies within all of this, where what their requirements are and what their needs are not necessarily the same. But we tend to lump them together in this, broad-based defense industrial base, slogan, if you will, because there is something unique about them, which is they serve one customer and one customer only, and that's the U.S. government.
So just for sake of extra clarity, as folks are listening to this and saying, am I in or am I out? When you think about newer players who have attained pretty significant status in this market. Let's take, for example, a Palantir company. Was a startup, now probably closer to prime. Are they in or out of the kind of the DIB in the construct of this report?
So this report mainly focused on hardware and those who are producing some of the physical systems. However, I would argue that Palantir, which provides software and provides specifically a mission an AI-enabled mission system that is critical to how the U.S. government is currently operating, particularly at the combatant command, so in Indo-PACOM, CENTCOM, and elsewhere, but also very critical to future operating concepts like CJAD C2. I would say that Palantir is a part of the defense industrial base, but only when we are talking not only about hardware, but also software being a core part of the DIB, of which I would argue it certainly is.
Got it. So even something like the Army's Titan the program, I think, is an interesting one where they're probably a crossover player.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So thanks for that. The definitional issue aside, why did this report need to be written now? What stoked your interest, and why did you all take this on?
let me start with my big tagline and what I wish everyone walked away from this report realizing, but this goes to my own sort of defense strategy nerd heart, which is the reason why this is so important right now is because there is a massive, massive chasm that exists between the defense strategy and defense industrial reality. Already, we've seen that, the DIB is unable to meet existing demands, and that is, what might be needed to equip Ukraine, what might be required to arm allies and partners around the globe, what might be needed to have a modern U.S. military that is capable of combating the most advanced threats. We don't have a DIB that is currently able to support that in the right amounts of weapons or the right types of systems. And those problems are only going to get harder as we move to the future and we have adversaries that are incorporating more advanced AI along with their physical systems and the ways in which we also have global dynamics that are going to make things really difficult. That would include long wars. That could include the increased chance of simultaneous conflict as we see U.S. adversaries starting to cooperate. And so it's a hard problem set. But until we square that circle and start having a singular conversation where the folks who are talking about defense strategy and its undergirding operational concepts start talking to industry and start having realistic conversations about, here are all of our planning assumptions. This is what we need to be able to carry out this mission. And start saying, can you build it? And hearing the answer where sometimes it's going to be, no, we can't. We can't build it in that amount. Or sometimes you're going to get an answer that says, yes, we can build it, but let us do you one better. And let us build you something else that gets after that problem in a smarter, better, more efficient way. So right now, we need to really just come together and have a singular conversation because that's the only way we're going to have innovative approaches and not only defense innovation when it comes down to new defense technologies, but also innovation when it comes down to creating operational concepts that pose really difficult problems for potential U.S. adversaries. But I think Phil might have some additional thoughts on this.
No, I think that's right. And I think, to the question of why did this report need to be written now, I think there was an urgency to it from a deterrence standpoint that we thought was really important, and at least that I thought was really resurfacing in a lot of the research we were doing, looking at the lead times for some of the items that we would need to produce in a great power conflict, and some of the case study work that we did on shipbuilding and artillery production. The amount of time that it has taken our defense industrial base to increase the rate of production for some of these items and the existing timelines for some of that production going into the future, I think there's a real concern there that our adversaries can look at those timelines and see opportunities or see chances to exploit those timelines. So I think we also look at this from an angle of what do we need to do now so that it also shores up our deterrent capabilities and also allow our allies to have a more deterrent posture as well.
I appreciate that, and I think especially as we're speaking today, this episode will be airing in early July, but as we're speaking here in kind of mid to late June, I think we're seeing this real time. There's been reporting in recent weeks, China's shipbuilding capacity dwarfs that of the U.S. Right, when you think about our ability to even respond if our existing inventory were to be in any way depleted or harmed, they are quickly going to outnumber the sheer number of vessels that we can produce. When you look at the Middle East and what we see with potentially a strategy now from Iran versus Israel and maybe the U.S. As of this moment, we don't really know what U.S. involvement kinetically may look like, but the ability to just kind of wait out and continue to wear down air defenses. We're seeing that intersection of capacity and capability and strategy, where just the existence of materiel is driving potential nation state strategy, how the game is played, so to speak. And so I think it's modern events are bearing out the case that you all made for why this matters.
If I can just jump in and say, we do a lot of wargaming. And a lot of our games tend to be a future potential US-China conflict over Taiwan. And in the first few days of that conflict, the United States is completely out of its preferred guided precision weapons. There are no PGMs to be had. So that just shows you, if that's just in the first few days and you look at the chance that you might see a longer conflict over time, that's pretty damning and pretty daunting, if you will, to think about what might actually be needed. And one of the reasons why, the U.S. finds itself completely out of Schlitz, so to speak, is because the U.S. defense industrial base cannot produce the weapons that are most needed and most relevant at the right amounts. And part of this is because they get this really unclear demand signal from the government, who are often not putting in full orders for some of the most important munitions. And I think this is where we've seen this crystallize the most. And this is why we've seen efforts from Congress in the past to try and do things like multi-year procurement of some of the key munitions, like the SM series that we see being expended in the Middle East, to try and steady that demand signal a little bit, to try and make it so that industry can actually start producing them at the levels needed. But I think munitions are just a great example of where all of this comes to roost. And it gets even more complicated when you realize that some of the assumptions made about how many munitions might be needed by defense planners is a bit of a tricky art, if I'm being polite. And then it also gets even more complicated with the fact that U.S. allies often will put in requests for munitions and are not necessarily as forthcoming about some of the information regarding what their stockpiles are and how much they might actually need.
That's an interesting one. And is that, just to double click on that last point, is that's out of like strategic ambiguity, or that's a hesitance to share full information about what they have, or why are they not being forthright about that?
I think that's, no matter how close the United States can be with another nation, there's always a casual withholding of information on both sides, even with some of the most special relationships or closest of alliances. And some of this also stems from the U.S. side, where there has been longstanding issues when it comes down to information sharing with allies and partners. And so ultimately, it truly should be a two-way street. So if the U.S. isn't going to be forthcoming about some of their information, whether that is their, scenarios, war plans, some of their assumptions about capabilities, other countries are going to follow suit. The other thing that's worth noting is, depending on the country, some of them don't necessarily have the same processes for calculating various needs when it comes down to different technologies or capabilities and counting things like munitions. So it becomes quite murky, in addition to already being stymied by some information sharing challenges.
Casual withholding of information kind of sounds like it sounds like a quip on a dating show. I'm going to have to think about where else that might be.
The worst Tinder profile known to man.
There you go. I do think I want to go through a little bit of like how we got here, because you all have a really nice diagnosis and kind of lay down of the situation. We'll come back to this. I want to flag something, especially for listeners on the startup side. I think there is a really interesting kind of opportunity here where there's two varieties of kind of startups or new entrants focused on the defense market. The first is around, hey, there's a new or novel capability. There's something that doesn't exist today that could or should, based on either commercial technology or new research and development, and it has a defense application or use case. That's the majority of where we see these kind of new startups focused. But there is a second kind, and I'm foreshadowing, we'll come back to this conversation, and that is, and we're starting to see some companies emerge who say, hey, we can make existing material or existing capabilities better, faster, more voluminous, and it's an execution risk situation where, hey, we are more responsive. And I think that's a really interesting bucket of startups. It's probably underweighted in the venture ecosystem at the moment. I want to come back to that on the end and just kind of get y'all's thoughts on it. But so that's the foreshadow. Let's bring it back to where you were, which is, just walk us through. You all have a nice laydown of kind of three of the reasons of why we got to where we are today in the defense industrial base, which I'm going to just kind of frame as that intersection of government demand and policy with industrial capacity. And so that's the consolidation, the demand, and then the bureaucratic rigidity. Walk us through that kind of lay down and what you all see there.
I'm happy to jump in on that. So in looking sort of at the history of the defense industrial base, even going back to World War II and then looking after the Cold War, you see a major drop-off in the U.S. government's investment in its industrial base after the Cold War. And some of this is peace dividend. Some of this is the sort of mythology around the Last Supper that I know is all that is known all too well by all the listeners on this show. And so you see a lot of consolidation of the defense industry around what are known now today as the main primes in the industry. And that has several effects on overall capacity, one of which is to reduce the overall capacity because there are less suppliers now in the market. The other effect that we think it has is it stymies competition a little bit. And to the point that you just alluded to in terms of now we're seeing some startups that are proposing not just to make new capabilities, but to make existing capabilities more quickly. Introducing that element into the market, I think, has a really salubrious effect on the market as a whole because it sends a signal to the older primes that the way they were doing things is going to need to change for them to be able to compete. And now there's this competitive element as opposed to a more monopolistic dynamic. Then the next issue that we see over the course of maybe the last 30 years, and this is borne out by the data that we collected, is there's an inconsistent demand signal to the industry about what the government wants. And so we've seen, we have a couple of different graphs in the report, one of which is follow through on munitions demand signal from the government. And basically what it illustrates, it's a lot of different bars going up and then down and then up and then back down. And it demonstrates that the government is not consistently purchasing what it wants from industry, or not sending a consistent demand signal year over year from what it wants from the industry. And that makes it really hard for industry to plan and organize its facility space around what it plans to produce. And so that's the demand signal problem that we see. And then the third issue, which I think kind of comes back to the dynamism or inhibiting the dynamism and competitiveness of the industry, is the regulatory rigidity. And so this we see in issues like recertifying new lines or the barriers to entry for new participants, where it can be very time and cost intensive to bid for contracts and hold out and wait for decisions on contracts. It can be very time and cost intensive to introduce or set up or flex new production lines to make new items. All of those things make the DIB a lot slower and a lot more costly to participate in. So that makes, again, the DIB less competitive and a little bit slower. And so all of that are sort of at a high level are the forces that lead us to the DIB we have today, which we argue needs to become a lot more dynamic, a lot more responsive, and have a lot more capacity if it's going to take on the challenges that we have.
Let me put a little bit of a finer point on it. At the end of the day, there's a number of reasons why the defense industrial base looks as it does. But at its heart, the U.S. government has the defense industrial base it paid for. It has the defense industrial base that it shaped. And so when we hear complaints from the U.S. government that the DIB isn't responsive enough, that there's a lot of risk aversion, that, it's unable to scale and surge production of different types of weapons, at its heart, the U.S. government has set the conditions for this to be the case. And this is where we've seen it coalesce under some of this reduced competition, this unclear demand that has truly shaped where we are, as well as all of these rigid processes and procedures and bureaucratic roadblocks that the U.S. government has put in place that has further served to make the defense industrial base what it is today, but also as small as it is today.
The size is I think, one of the points that comes up again and again, was just this consolidation. You have a very few, 6 kind of big players who control, I don't remember what the latest number is, but it's anywhere from 60 to 80% of kind of the contracts. What I want to talk about with you all, though, is this question of demand, because I think if it's consistency of demand or flexibility of adaptation, and you put a gun to my head and you said you can only have one, I'm taking flexibility every time. And that's because we just don't know. We live in an emergent world. Like, we don't know the wars that we're going to have to fight. And God willing, hopefully it's none. But the ability to respond to those events is what makes us, I think, a dominant power. So when you think about that government predictability or consistency of demand, obviously, everyone in the Pentagon would love more munitions, love more of all of this because it allows more flexibility. But we thankfully also live in a budget constrained environment, or hopefully are moving towards that world. We don't just spend endlessly. And so there are some balances to kind of across these different capabilities, and the pie is only so big. What do you think is realistic in terms of getting to consistency of government demand, or maybe even drill down a little bit about what we mean there and what's feasible in the near term?
I think you said something that's really interesting, which is, wanting flexibility. And part of that is because we don't know the types of wars that we're going to get into. And I think what you're describing is, emblematic of a core part of defense planning, which is defense planning under uncertainty. But we have these budget constraints that you mentioned, so we can't just buy some of everything or be able to have it all. We need to make some of these choices and we need to make some of these trade-offs. But we need to be making the right trade-offs. And this is where I think we've seen historically some of the most frenetic approaches to government procurement, where oftentimes it is trying to make trade-offs and it comes at the expense of things that we know are important. We know that it might come more traditionally at the expense of munitions, which have been the bill payer when, say, the Air Force has needed to find some more money to pay for personnel or other items, some of the big ticket airframes, for example. So it's making the right trade-offs, but making it so that you still have some demand, because there are these huge pendulum swings that you see when all of a sudden you procure a lot of something and then you stop. And that has knock-on effects where you have lines that eventually go obsolete. You have problems related to tooling, facilitation, and workforce that just make it so much harder to be able to start back up again. So it's trying to make sure that there's consistency so that we don't have breaks in buy when we have some items that we know that we're going to need, instead of always just scrambling to restart things, like we saw with some of the equipment that we provided to Ukraine, where we needed to restart whole Stinger lines, but also making sure that we're not overcorrecting so that there is some consistency in demand, but we still have the flexibility to be able to surge. And that, I would argue, that sort of surge flexibility comes more about the numbers. You might not know exactly how much of something you need, or say in a potential protracted conflict, how that's going to ebb and flow and change what equipment is most relevant. So being able to have some things like a little bit more flexible tooling, having stockpiles of some of those long lead items that allow you to be able to ramp up well in advance are really important. And here I would also argue it's being smart, both about weapons design, but also about future manufacturing techniques. So thinking a little bit about things like modular munitions or systems that can be produced on the same line. So you have that flexibility. For example, what we see with LRASM and JASM already, where you can move more towards one versus another. And then also just thinking a little bit about what is the role of additive manufacturing? Where does that give you the flexibility to be able to ramp up production when needed, when you have some of these big changes in demand? So there's something to be said about needing consistency in demand from the U.S. government for the most important things, but still having that door open to be able to ramp up something wholly different, or in some cases, entirely new.
It's an important point, and I would say the ability to ramp some things up also requires the ability to then conversely ramp some things down. You all did an interesting case study or deep dive into one such attempt in the report. You talked about the Air Force's attempt to divest from certain airframes. And for those who are familiar with kind of the big brouhaha with Congress over the A-10, the Warthog over the last, I think it's the last decade or so. I can't really keep track. That may kind of ring true for you. Phil, I think you dug into some of this. Talk us through, what did the Air Force try to do with these airframes, and why did it prove so difficult?
Well, the Air Force has been trying to divest of its A-10s in an effort to modernize its fleet and reallocate resources to some of its more priority, future-forward priorities. And Congress has has made it very difficult to do so, I'll say. So the first big divestment attempt came in fiscal year 2016. The Air Force put forward a divestment of 165 A-10 aircraft. Congress denied those divestments, and there have been continued efforts to divest in the ensuing years since. And the other thing to point out is it's not just the A-10. There have been plenty of other aircraft the Air Force has tried to divest from, including the F-16, certain variations of the F-16, the F-15. And similarly, Congress has been reticent to dispense with some of those older capabilities. Something should be said, I think, for the role of those capabilities in the force and the need to retain some of those aircraft as a hedge effectively. But I also think that the challenge here is how do you manage, as mentioned, fortunately, we live in a budget-constrained environment. How do you manage that imperative when you have modernization needs and there are aircraft that are absorbing a lot of sustainment cost to maintain? So the Air Force has continued to push this forward. Most recently, they've been trying to divest and reallocate money for their tanker fleet. Congress has also had trouble with that as well in the most recent fiscal year. So this has been the continuing batting of the ball back and forth that has, again, made it very difficult for industry to see where will their money get allocated to in terms of preparing their facilities and their resources to meet the demand, whatever that ends up being.
Okay, let's dive deeper into why. This is what I wanted to unpack with you guys. I think this is important. When you say Congress didn't permit divestment of airframes, let's go a level deeper. What's really happening there?
Well, let me just put it very baldly.
What?
Members of Congress are voted in by constituents. Constituents happen to live in very particular geographies. Within those geographies, some more so than others, there are weapons factories, there are facilities, there are shipyards. These are jobs. And so for Congress, a lot of times when they hear divestment from any type of airframe, from an A-10 to an F-15, they hear shutting down a factory or a facility in my district, which means job loss in my district, which means I might have some trouble next time I have to, have folks go to the ballot box. So that is some of the dynamic that we face. And in some cases, that's not totally true. At least that's not the only reason, but oftentimes that is a big driving factor. There have been times where Congress has essentially held the DoD and the military services feet to the fire and said, no, you guys said, for example, this was your top priority, but you only purchased a few of them. We're going to plus that up because you said you needed it. And we just sat through a bunch of posture hearings where you said how important it was. So we're going to make sure that that happens. But this also creates a perverse dynamic when it comes down to developing any type of budget for the DoD, where sometimes you purposely have the DoD and services leaving out things because they think that Congress will be able to, plus it up in a way that they're not when they're trying to make some of those trades. And I think we also see this a lot with some of the combatant commands where they put in their unfunded requirements lists because they know that Congress will be able to get them more capability than what they asked for in the initial budget.
So we've talked about on this program many a time the value of lobbying for small companies that want to get, some of those congressional ads. It's typically around up to $5 million. What you're seeing is how that system works on both sides, right? So whether it's constituents in their districts or whether it's the large prime saying, hey, we've invested in this. We want more out of this program. Congress, you see the value of this. It's the nature of our system where there's multiple kings or there's multiple, okay, that's a bad word right now, multiple captains, there's multiple folks who you to convince of the value of your technology. And so that, the fundamental nature of the system is likely not going to change. I don't think that's what you all are recommending here is that we ban this or we ban that. It's how do those different pieces work together to manage the overall picture. And I'm curious, for this one in particular, you alongside the demand kind of piece of things, you've talked about some of the bureaucratic inflexibility or some of the regulatory burdens here. Let's unpack that a little bit and talk about that piece of the equation as well, because I think it's a nice complement to this other piece.
I think there's a few different bureaucratic processes that make it real difficult to do business with the US government. One is the fact that there's just so much paperwork that it even takes to be able to put in a decent bid for one of the larger contracts, whether that is a firm fixed price contract, whether that is a winner takes all contract, whatever it might be. And this is why we have seen the dominance of the primes, because more often than not, they are the only ones who actually have the administrative tail and the funds to be able to bid for some of these large programs. We're seeing a bit of a change in that, both with the U.S. government starting to, privilege commercial solutions or use OTAs. And also, frankly, that there are some of these new entrants who have pretty significant capital backing. So that enables them to bid for some of these different things. But it does make it really difficult for smaller companies to be able to try and break in and do business with the Department of Defense. I also think that there are just some basic things, whether that is, the FAR and the DFAR, whether that is some of the excessive hurdles when it comes down to safety checks. When you are producing a system on a factory line. These are things that are super necessary, but sometimes just the amount that they occur and the paperwork that they require, as well as the labor requirements of them, tend to really eat into a lot of time and effort that could be spent in other directions. And then if we're just talking about bureaucratic processes, I mean, we could go on and on about how many are broken, but I think the one that I'll point to as being sort of the quintessential example of a broken process is foreign military sales, where you just have something that takes entirely too long, is a little bit of a black box, no matter how many congressional task forces we've had, no matter how many Department of Defense or Department of State Tiger teams we've had that are going to create a solution to this problem, it is still an issue. And you still have, different countries and allies who are waiting years and years for defense items that they have purchased. So they have purchased these, they are feeding into the US defense economy, but they're still not getting what they've asked for. And I know that there are some more recent attempts by this administration to try and fix that process with an executive order that is going to essentially try and come up with a new prioritization for foreign military sales. But there's not a lot of detail and there's not a lot of there. And this is an area where we could try and, make some headway in streamlining it, but also thinking about the knock-on processes that might also need to be streamlined in order to make foreign military sales, as well as things like co-production and co-development of weapons with allies and partners, a reality. And that means going head-to-head when it comes down to trying to get more ITAR exemptions or break through some of the, congressional statutes, such as, Buy America, the Berry Amendment, to try and work through those.
Appreciate that laydown. I think it's a good summation of where we're at. Some of this hopefully we can chip away at. The one piece I wanted one more piece I wanted to touch on before we move to some of the opportunities here, and maybe in particular some of your recommendations and some of the implications for some of the startups or newer players. But one thing we haven't talked about explicitly is the nature of the supply chain. And you talked about the issues with the responsiveness and the ability of the defense industrial base to fulfill our defense requirements, our warfighting requirements. One thing that I'd be curious to get your take on is the nature of where we are getting critical materials for some of these capabilities today. And I know as we're just right approaching kind of the Reindustrialize summit, there's a whole movement of people right now very, very focused on onshoring manufacturing capability, making things in the United States again, not just from a jobs perspective, but from a national security perspective. And I'm curious how that intersects with what you all are seeing here in terms of the flexibility and responsiveness of the div.
The first half of the question, there's massive movement to onshore. we lay out really, I think, clearly in the report that a lot of our U.S. supply chains, especially in the defense industry, are vulnerable to external sourcing, particularly from sources like China or Russia, specifically China, that we would prefer not to get some of our defense items from or the raw materials for them. The onshoring movement is real and the friendshoring movement is real. I think it's important. It'll be really important, I think, for some of our closest allies like Canada, Europe, where there are very mature either existing supply chains or prospects to develop supply chains. The challenge, I think, for onshoring is the cost that will introduce, because especially if it's going to be domestic standing up of supply lines in the United States, the kind of regulatory burdens that will be there from an environmental standpoint, which are perfectly justified. And I think it's probably for the best that we have some environmental regulations in the United States, but that will add more cost. And in a budget constrained environment, those costs will add up. And I'm curious to see what that will do to what the Defense Department is able to actually procure at the bottom line. Is that going to cut back, or is that going to result in even further investment and just to stomach some of that cost? Or are we going to see some paring down on what the total procurement number is going to be?
So I think there's also another hidden cost that tacks onto what Phil just mentioned, which is a time cost. So in order to reindustrialize America, in order to onshore some of these critical industries that we haven't had for quite some time, or at least bolster what industry still exists, that's going to take time to build up. But the U.S. doesn't have that kind of time when you look at just the intense need for defense items. So in the interim, we need to find different ways of doing sourcing, particularly from allies, to make sure that we don't have some of these adversarial sourcing. And this, to me, if we're looking at, say, critical minerals and other materials, means that we are going to go more to allies like Canada. But at the same time, we need to think about some of the impact that some of the broader geopolitics have had on our relationship with Canada. Things like tariffs. How is that going to impact our ability to bring in some of these materials and bring in some of Canadian industry where we might need to? So it's all kind of tied and wrapped up together in a way that I don't think folks are totally acknowledging. But I also think one thing that is overlooked is the time constraint, and that we're almost looking at different phases of time where we have this interim where we're going to need to source from others as we try and bolster our own industries. And then the last thing that I will just say is, honestly, I happen to look at some of the material requirements that the U.S. has and where it gets some of the most important things that go into magnets, sensors, radars, you name it, and it all goes back to China. So if I were a betting woman and I were trying to make some future long-term investments, I would be investing in things like the development of synthetic materials that are able to mimic or have very similar profiles or attributes to some of the other things that we are using. And that's an area where it's still very nascent and it's largely at universities and research institutions, but those are all facing some big cuts as it relates to university R&D. So we need to think a little bit more broader about, where it is the U.S. government should be putting its money, should be investing in order to have the types of innovation it needs, but also the type of resilience that it's going to need in the future to be able to make sure that we don't have adversarial materials or components in our systems, or that an adversary could completely choke us off and create problems that could be lasting and incredibly problematic in a potential military conflict.
Our entire economy over the last 30 years has been built for all intents and purposes peacetime. It's been wars of choice and wars abroad, and not really kind of built with peer competitors or peer adversaries in mind. So I think that's really, really well said. As we move towards the final piece here, I'd love to get from you, Phil and Becca, one kind of your number one item on your wish list for three categories of groups. The first is the U.S. government. You all speak a lot about that in the report. The second is let's call it the legacy primes, the legacy defense industrial base. That is the focus of the report. And then the third is for the newcomers, the new players, the non-traditionals, the dual use, the startup community of which many of whom are likely listening to this right now. What's one thing you'd like to see each of those groups do? And I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but I'm sure you'll have a great answer.
I've got one for each.
Let's go, Phil.
Starting with the government. Funny that after working on this report, I've now been working on a budget report, and it dives into the relationship between procurement and research and development. And there's immediate overlap with the defense industrial base, because now we didn't go into too much on the demand signal piece, but now I'm like really in it at a pretty deep level. And my number one request for the government is procure the things that we need. Really just buy the stuff that we need. Does not matter what industry is able to. I mean, it matters what industry is able to do. But if government's not buying it, it might as well not be there. So, and that's a little bit of a simplification, but in some ways it's not, because we need the stuff to be built and we need it to be bought, we need it to be fielded. And for the last 20, 30 years, the government has spent more and more money on research and development, more and more money on operations, but not as much money on fielding the future force. So I think that would be my number one request for the government. For the primes, it would be to leverage more commercial technology and to see ways in which that the manufacturing processes for different items can be more innovative, specifically. And I think that there are opportunities to make our production lines more flexible in ways that the commercial industries have mastered, which our defense industries have been slower to adapt, in part because there hasn't been an incentive or a need to. There hasn't been an incentive to take on that extra efficiency. And I'm hoping that as the industry becomes more competitive, that incentive will present itself. But I also think the incentive is a strategic one for the country. And so if the market incentive isn't there, then I hope at least the government will provide that incentive by way of funding that kind of responsiveness and flexibility. And then the third, for startups, similar to the flexibility point, I would love to see more and more startups, I think some are doing this, embed flexibility into their manufacturing process from the jump, so that as their systems evolve and as the strategic environment evolves, whatever items they're producing, be it software or hardware, can adapt more flexibly and more efficiently in real time. The other, a great example I think of not doing this so well is the F-35, where a lot of the updates and RDT that's gone into it over time has ballooned, taken far longer than anticipated. And I think the next generations of systems and the next generation of startups, it would be fantastic to see more attention paid to how to make those designs more modular and more flexible to adapt as needed as new imperatives and new technologies present themselves. Those are my three requests. It would be great, but we'll see.
Okay, is it my turn for my Christmas wish list?
Let's do it.
So Phil stole mine for the U.S. government, except he said it in a much more eloquent way. I was just going to say, buy your damn weapons. And that is a great tagline, but Phil explained it much better. So if I can pivot and say a different one, I would say the U.S. government needs to make this a level playing field. It needs to make it a level playing field so that you have all parts of the defense industrial base can play a role. Everyone can bid for contracts, and that's making sure that primes aren't the only one who can go for winner takes all contracts. It's making sure that, some of these non-traditionals and new entrants aren't the only ones who can actually leverage OTAs or some of these commercial solutions. It's trying to just find a way to make a defense industrial base that actually has more hardy competition by having that level playing field. If I can make one request of the primes, I've got several, but if I had to choose one, I would say it is investing more in IRAD, in internal research and development, and starting to be the innovators, and specifically investing more in IRAD when it comes to building true low-cost attritable systems. Right now, what we see as the price tag for some of the attritable systems that folks are thinking of, I would argue they are not low cost, and therefore, by virtue of that, they are not truly attritable. And this is an area where I think the primes can start to do more work and do more innovation and try and get to a better place on the cost curve. And then for the new entrants, here what I would really like to see from them, and I hope we do see, is seeing them being able to scale production. Because right now you do have some winners, and they are good winners. There's some good technology behind everything. But for the most part, they have winning contracts when it comes down to prototypes or small scale production. Having to do production at the numbers of systems we are going to need for future conflict, it's quite high and it's quite massive, and it looks very different from what some of these unicorns and winning new entrants have been asked to do. So trying to actually invest in their ability to scale production is going to be crucial, frankly, to their success, but also something that I would like to see more of, because I think that would also end up pushing back against some of the naysayers that say this is a one-off or it's smoke and mirrors. To demonstrate that they can actually scale production would go a long way to, I think, opening the door to having these new entrants and non-traditionals across the board playing a key role in the defense industry.
It's a good list for Christmas shopping. I think that's, we've covered a lot of ground here. I appreciate, Becca and Phil, that you both are doing this work and helping to educate folks as to the situation as it lies and kind of what's needed to push us forward. So thank you. We'll look forward to seeing, Phil, your next piece of work. And Becca, know that you'll be continue to be prolific in your publishing and thought leadership. I appreciate both of you for taking the time today to join us. And I guess I'll before we wrap, is there any final words that you want to leave folks with?
I feel talked out. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. Again, thanks so much for having us. And if there's anything that comes out of this work, whether it's just sort of broad-based education or at least trying to point folks in the right directions of things that could be done and should be done, I think both Phil and I will feel as though we've done our jobs at least.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, thank you both. Thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you soon.